He inherited 3,000 acres. 100 houses were already sitting on them. Daniel Walker figured he'd inherited his family's land and not much else. A quiet stretch of Texas Valley, a piece of family history. Nothing complicated. His first morning walking the property told him otherwise. Past a distant ridge sat an entire neighborhood he'd never known existed. Paved streets, expensive homes, security gates, an HOA. Nearly 100 families living their lives on ground that, according to Daniel's inheritance paperwork, had never stopped belonging to his family. He followed the old ranch road his grandfather used to drive, and it just ended at a security gate that had no business being there. A sign read Whitmore Valley Estates Homeowners Association. Daniel stood at the bars for a long moment, trying to process the fact that somebody had built a full neighborhood in the middle of his inheritance. That night, he spread every document he owned across the desk in his grandfather's old ranch office. The family deed, county maps, surveys, tax records. The boundaries weren't ambiguous. The entire development sat inside his 3,000 acres. The next morning, he went to the county records office, expecting some reasonable explanation. Instead, the clerk looked at his paperwork and asked him something he wouldn't forget. "Do you know what's built on that land?" He knew about the houses. What he didn't know was how they'd gotten there. His attorney started digging into property's history, and the deeper they went, the stranger it got. This wasn't a neighborhood quietly encroaching on someone's land. It looked more like an entire community built on top of a chain of transactions that never should have held up. Then Daniel met Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She was furious before he'd said much of anything. Insistent community had been there for years, that every homeowner had bought in legally. Daniel held up his family's deed and asked one question. "Show me where my family sold this land." She had nothing. Instead, she warned him that pursuing this would ruin 100 families' lives. Daniel wasn't trying to ruin anyone. He just wanted to understand how an entire neighborhood had appeared on land his family had never sold. The story spread through Whitmore Valley fast. Neighbors started arguing among themselves, some blaming Daniel outright, others quietly wondering, for the first time, whether their own home sat on ground a developer never actually owned. Then Daniel found a thing that changed everything. Late one night, back out of the property line, he dug up an old boundary marker buried under decades of landscaping. It carried his family's original ranch survey number. The HOA's modern streets ran straight across a boundary that had been sitting there untouched the whole time. What the archives remembered, it went to court. The HOA argued that decades of residency and legitimate home sales gave the community legal standing. Daniel's attorney pushed back with a simple point. Time doesn't turn someone else's land into yours. Then his team laid out the original survey. The development sat entirely inside Daniel's inherited boundary. No ambiguity left to argue over. Karen's confidence started to slip, but the real gut punch was still sitting in the county archives. Daniel and his attorney turned up an old development agreement showing the original developer had intended to buy the valley, but the final transfer had never gone through. Daniel's grandfather had turned down the last offer. The land had never been sold, leased, or legally transferred to anyone. The homes had been sold anyway. Daniel found himself somewhere he never expected, legally in the right, but staring down 100 families who genuinely believed they bought legitimate homes. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth, and he wanted his family's land back. Those two things just happened to come at a cost he hadn't asked for. Months of legal proceedings later, the court ruled. The HOA couldn't establish legal ownership of the land beneath the development. Residents were given a set window to vacate. Panic spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. 100 families facing a future none of them had planned for. Many blamed Daniel. He didn't argue back. He stood at the gate and told them plainly that he hadn't built their neighborhood or sold them their homes. He just couldn't pretend his family hadn't been quietly cut out of their own land for decades. When the deadline arrived, sheriff's deputies came to oversee the process and keep things calm. Karen still wasn't ready to accept it, but the order was final. The chain came off the gate, and for the first time in decades, Daniel Walker walked onto land that had been his family's entire time. Over the following days, the neighborhood emptied out. Moving trucks, packed boxes, quiet streets where kids used to play. It wasn't the wind Daniel had pictured. Every truck pulling away carried a family heading towards something they hadn't seen coming. When the last one finally left, Daniel climbed to the highest ridge overlooking the valley. The houses were still there, scattered across the hillside, but the ground underneath them had finally come back to where it belonged. He'd inherited 3,000 acres. What he actually recovered was something hard to put a price on, a piece of his family's history that a whole community had, without meaning to nearly erased. And now, looking out over 100 empty houses, Daniel had one question left to answer. What came next?